Okay, so we're just going to take you back to the UK in Windsor Castle in St George's Hall, where the guests have arrived, including the Queen Camilla.
It was not an apology, it was not a defense, it was the palace admitting something had broken and could not be ignored. The confirmation. Just before first light broke across London, while the city still held its breath in that fragile space between night and morning, Buckingham Palace released a confirmation it had clearly hoped to avoid. The wording was restrained, almost antiseptic, but its meaning landed with unmistakable force. The palace acknowledged that damage had occurred following a controversial internal action, and that corrective measures were now underway. No names were mentioned, no explanations offered, yet the implication was unmistakable. Something inside the monarchy's carefully balanced structure had fractured, and the fracture was no longer containable through silence alone. What made the confirmation so unsettling was not its content, but its timing. Early winter mornings are chosen only when urgency overrides tradition. This was not a clarification issued to satisfy curiosity, nor a routine adjustment dressed in formal language. It was a signal to insiders, diplomats, and seasoned observers that containment had failed. The palace does not lightly admit disruption, and when it does, it is because internal alarms have already sounded for too long. By choosing this hour, the institution acknowledged that waiting any longer would risk allowing speculation to harden into belief. Within minutes, royal correspondents understood the gravity of what they were reading. The language carried familiar markers, references to internal review, acknowledgments of procedural impact, and a phrase that stood out sharply to anyone fluent in palace communication. Corrective measures are underway. That sentence alone suggested authority had been exercised beyond its proper bounds, and that trust within the system had been compromised. This was not about embarrassment or optics, it was about control, and the quiet admission that control had briefly slipped. Across Britain, the reaction was subdued but immediate. Commuters paused over their phones. Morning radio hosts lowered their voices. Older listeners, those who had lived through previous royal crises, felt the chill more than others. They recognized the pattern instinctively. Institutions only confirm damage when repair has already begun behind closed doors. This was not the beginning of a story. It was the midpoint, revealed only because the consequences had started to surface in places the palace could no longer shield. Behind the palace gates, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Senior aides moved with deliberate calm, but the pace quickened. Documents were retrieved. Approval chains were re-examined. Meetings that had been postponed in the hope of quiet resolution were now unavoidable. The confirmation did not assign blame, but it narrowed the field. Everyone inside the system knew the source, and everyone understood that the acknowledgement was as much about restoring confidence as it was about correcting procedure. What unsettled the institution most was not public reaction, but private fallout. For days, subtle signs had accumulated: staff uncertainty, conflicting instructions, international partners requesting clarification through channels rarely used for ceremonial matters. None of it was dramatic enough to provoke headlines, yet collectively alarming. The monarchy survives on coherence, and coherence depends on clarity of authority. Once that clarity is questioned, even briefly, the damage spreads faster than any official statement can track. By mid-morning, coverage had crossed the Atlantic. American networks framed the confirmation as rare and revealing, noting the palace's reluctance to speak unless forced by necessity. Analysts debated what kind of action could prompt such language without naming names. Some speculated about power dynamics. Others focused on timing, noting that the monarchy was already navigating a fragile winter marked by health sensitivities and an institutional transition. The idea that additional instability had been introduced, even unintentionally, unsettled audiences who remembered how quickly royal fractures could escalate. Inside the monarchy, however, the meaning was far more precise. This confirmation was not about a scandal. It was about boundaries. Somewhere along the line, influence had been mistaken for permission, and tradition for flexibility. A decision had been taken that disrupted the invisible architecture holding the institution upright. The palace now faced the task of repairing that architecture without further exposing its weaknesses, a balance it had failed to strike in the past with costly consequences. As the morning progressed, one truth became unavoidable. The confirmation marked a turning point, not because it explained what happened, but because it conceded that something had gone wrong. In royal terms, that admission is profound. It signals that the issue has moved beyond internal correction and into the realm of institutional accountability. What followed would not unfold loudly or quickly, but it would reshape relationships, authority, and trust within the palace walls. This is why the confirmation matters, not because it names a controversy, but because it acknowledges damage in a system built on the illusion of permanence. Once that illusion cracks even slightly, the institution must move decisively to restore it. And in doing so, it reveals just how fragile the balance has become. The action that crossed the line, the action that triggered the palace's confirmation, did not arrive with spectacle or warning. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no visible rupture that outsiders could immediately point to. Instead, it unfolded quietly, embedded in routine, disguised as efficiency. That subtlety is precisely what made it so dangerous. Within an institution governed by precedent, even the slightest deviation, if left unchecked, can destabilize far more than anyone initially intends. In the final stretch of November, as winter schedules tightened and the monarchy prepared for a compressed series of ceremonial obligations, Camilla approved a sequence of internal adjustments that bypassed established review processes. On paper, they appeared minor. A reordered ceremonial sequence here, a revised advisory input there. Each change, taken on its own, could be defended as practical. Together, they formed a pattern that signaled something far more serious. Authority was being exercised without the consensus that gives it legitimacy. The first point of concern emerged around ceremonial hierarchy. A winter event tied closely to royal legacy was subtly restructured, shifting symbolic emphasis in a way that seasoned staff immediately noticed. To the public, it would have looked seamless. To those inside the palace, it felt jarring. Ceremonial order is not aesthetic. It is constitutional language expressed through ritual. Altering it without formal approval is not innovation, it is interference. Staff hesitated to challenge the changes outright. Camilla's position carried weight, and her long journey into acceptance had fostered a protective instinct among some advisors. Yet discomfort grew as instructions arrived through unfamiliar channels. Instead of flowing through the ceremonial office, decisions were routed via a smaller private advisory loop. This was not merely a shortcut. It suggested the emergence of parallel authority, something the monarchy cannot tolerate without consequence. Confusion followed, not rebellion. That distinction matters. Staff did not resist because they questioned loyalty. They hesitated because they questioned clarity. When authority becomes ambiguous, even the most disciplined institutions slow down. Emails went unanswered. Clarifications were requested repeatedly. Plans stalled as aides waited for confirmation that never came. What should have been seamless coordination began to fracture under uncertainty. Princess Anne was the first to intervene decisively. Her instincts, honed over decades of protecting tradition from erosion, detected the shift immediately. She did not accuse. She asked questions. She demanded documentation. When answers proved inconsistent, she halted several preparations outright. That pause exposed how far the adjustments had progressed without proper oversight. What initially seemed like isolated decisions revealed themselves as part of a broader assumption that influence could substitute for process. William's response was colder, more strategic. Briefed on the situation, he saw beyond the immediate disruption to the longer-term risk. The monarchy was already navigating a fragile period marked by health sensitivities, international scrutiny, and generational transition. Any perception of internal disorder would invite external pressure. In a media environment primed to interpret confusion as conflict, even procedural missteps could metastasize into reputational damage. Charles, caught between roles, hesitated. His reluctance was not denial, but delay. He understood the implications, yet confronting Camilla meant acknowledging that a line had already been crossed under his watch. The longer the issue remained unresolved, the more entrenched the damage became. What began as an internal correction now carried the weight of institutional precedent. Allowing it to stand would signal tolerance. Reversing it would signal a fracture. As internal assessments continued, the scope of the issue widened. It was no longer about a single adjustment or even a series of them. It was about the assumption behind them, the belief that long-earned influence granted freedom from constraint. In monarchies, that belief is corrosive. Authority does not expand through tenure. It is constrained by structure, renewed through restraint, and legitimized only through collective agreement. By the time senior staff completed their review, the conclusion was unavoidable. The action had crossed a line not because it was malicious, but because it undermined the architecture that holds the monarchy together. The protocol had been disrupted, staff confidence shaken, external perception unsettled. These are not cosmetic issues. They are structural warnings. Once crossed, the line could not be uncrossed quietly. Correction without acknowledgement would leave the underlying assumption intact. Silence would allow speculation to fill the gaps. The palace now faced a stark choice: restore boundaries openly, or risk letting erosion masquerade as evolution. In choosing to confirm damage, the monarchy accepted short-term discomfort to prevent long-term decay, and that decision reshaped everything that followed: the damage assessment. Damage inside a monarchy rarely announces itself through visible collapse. There are no broken windows, no public resignations, no immediate headlines declaring failure. Instead, it appears in quieter, more insidious ways. In hesitation where confidence once lived. In duplicated briefings, the authority was apparent. In the subtle shift from decisiveness to caution, something fundamental has been unsettled. By the time Buckingham Palace began its formal assessment, the damage had already spread far beyond the original action. The first indicators emerged within internal communications. Departments that normally functioned with near-instinctive coordination began to slow down. Requests for approval multiplied. Staff who once relied on verbal confirmation now asked for written authorization. This was not bureaucratic excess, it was self-protection. When authority becomes ambiguous, even briefly, people instinctively shield themselves from blame. That instinct, left unchecked, can paralyze an institution built on precision. Senior aides noticed the change almost immediately. Meetings grew longer without producing clarity. Instructions were repeated with slightly altered phrasing, a sign that no one was entirely certain which version carried final authority. In some cases, plans moved forward only to be quietly revised hours later. Each adjustment added another layer of uncertainty, eroding trust not through conflict, but through confusion. Within days, what should have been a contained issue began affecting unrelated areas of palace operations. Beyond the palace walls, the damage manifested differently. Diplomatic partners accustomed to the monarchy's disciplined consistency began noticing discrepancies between ceremonial schedules and public messaging. These were not confrontational inquiries. They arrived softly, through back channels reserved for delicate clarification. Questions about timing, questions about protocol, questions suggested that foreign offices sensed an internal recalibration but lacked confirmation. For an institution whose global credibility rests on reliability, even those gentle questions represented a significant breach. Media response fractured along familiar lines, yet even that fragmentation carried warning signs. British coverage leaned toward institutional analysis, framing the situation as an internal correction rather than a personal failing. American outlets, particularly those catering to older audiences, focused on psychological interpretation. They questioned whether unresolved legacy tensions were resurfacing at a moment when stability mattered most. Neither narrative was overtly hostile, but both reflected the same underlying concern. Something inside the monarchy had lost alignment. Internally, the palace initiated a broader audit. What began as a review of one controversial action expanded into an examination of advisory structures themselves, who held influence, how decisions flowed. Where informal authority had started to replace formal process, the findings were unsettling, not because they revealed intent, but because they revealed assumption. Over time, boundaries had softened without explicit agreement, allowing personal confidence to fill spaces once occupied by protocol. That realization forced a more profound reckoning. The damage was not confined to a single individual or office. It had exposed a vulnerability within the system itself. When roles blur and oversight relaxes, even temporarily, the monarchy's greatest asset, its predictability, begins to fracture. Predictability is not stagnation, it is a reassurance. Once shaken, restoring it requires more than quiet correction. It demands a visible reassertion of structure. Staff morale became an unspoken concern. Palace employees are trained to operate within clear hierarchies. Ambiguity unsettles them not emotionally, but professionally. Several senior aides privately expressed unease, noting that they had never before questioned which instructions carried final authority. That doubt, once introduced, does not disappear easily. It lingers, influencing future decisions long after the original issue has been resolved. The most sobering aspect of the assessment lay in its cumulative nature. No single adjustment had caused catastrophic harm. No single decision could be pointed to as reckless. Yet together, they had produced a measurable erosion of confidence internally and externally. This is the kind of damage institutions fear most because it cannot be undone with a single statement or correction. It requires sustained recalibration and a clear signal that boundaries have been restored. By the time the assessment concluded, one conclusion was unavoidable. The monarchy had weathered the initial disruption, but only narrowly. Left unaddressed, the damage would have deepened, inviting speculation, resistance, and external pressure. Acknowledgement was no longer optional. It was necessary to prevent erosion from becoming prevalent. The palace's confirmation did not mark the end of the damage, it marked the beginning of the repair. But repair, especially in institutions built on centuries of tradition, comes at a cost. It demands accountability, restraint, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily stability can be compromised. And as the monarchy moved forward, it did so with a renewed awareness of just how fragile its balance had become. The internal reckoning. The reckoning did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation, nor did it unfold in a single decisive meeting. It emerged slowly, deliberately, through a sequence of restrained conversations that carried far more weight than raised voices ever could. Inside Buckingham Palace, where tone often matters more than content, the shift was unmistakable. The atmosphere changed from cautious monitoring to unavoidable confrontation, and everyone involved understood that what was being discussed now would define not just a response, but a precedent. Princess Anne spoke first, as she so often does when institutions begin to drift. Her intervention was not emotional and certainly not personal. She framed the issue in the language she trusts most: duty, continuity, and structure. Tradition, she reminded those present, is not decorative. It exists to prevent precisely this kind of ambiguity. When the process is bent without consensus, authority weakens everywhere, not just in the moment where the bend occurs. Her words were calm, but they landed heavily, because no one in that room could refute them. William approached the reckoning from a different angle, one shaped by the future rather than the past. Where Anne focused on what had been disrupted, William focused on what might follow if the disruption went uncorrected. He spoke of cumulative risk, of how quickly modern narratives turn uncertainty into accusation. In an age where silence is interpreted as complicity, even procedural confusion can metastasize into reputational damage. His concern was not about blame, but about containment, and more importantly, about prevention. Charles listened longer than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried the weight of a man standing at the intersection of roles that could not be neatly separated: king and husband, leader and partner. His struggle was visible not in hesitation alone, but in the careful way he framed each response. He did not dispute the facts laid before him. He did not minimize the disruption. Instead, he wrestled openly with the cost of acknowledgement. To confront the issue entirely meant facing the reality that it had unfolded under his watch. Camilla was not present for every conversation, but her absence was felt as acutely as her presence had been in earlier months. Those involved were careful with their language, not out of fear but out of recognition that this reckoning carried personal consequences. Yet the monarchy does not allow personal discomfort to outweigh institutional necessity. The longer the discussions continued, the clearer it became that this was no longer about correcting an action. It was about restoring confidence in the system that enabled that action. As the conversations deepened, the focus shifted from what had happened to why it had been allowed. Advisors examined how informal influence had gradually expanded into operational authority without explicit approval. This was not framed as ambition or malice, it was framed as drift, a slow erosion of boundaries that occurs when success breeds confidence and confidence dulls caution. The recognition was uncomfortable precisely because it implicated not one person, but the collective willingness to look away while minor exceptions accumulated. Anne returned to this point repeatedly, her tone unwavering. Institutions survive, she said, not because they never make mistakes, but because they correct them before they become habits. Allowing this moment to pass without a firm response would not preserve harmony, it would invite repetition. Her argument was not punitive, it was preventative. And in that distinction, many in the room found clarity that they had been struggling to articulate. William reinforced the urgency by highlighting external pressures that could no longer be ignored. International partners had already sensed recalibration. Media narratives were beginning to harden around the idea of internal instability. The monarchy, he warned, did not have the luxury of gradualism in this moment. Delay would be interpreted as weakness. Silence would be filled by speculation. The institution needed to reclaim its narrative decisively, not to assign fault, but to reassert structure. Charles's internal conflict reached its apex during these discussions. He understood the necessity of drawing boundaries, yet he also understood the human cost of doing so publicly. The monarchy demands sacrifices that are rarely acknowledged, and this was one of them. He had spent decades defending Camilla, helping her weather scrutiny that would have broken many others. Now he faced the reality that protecting the institution might require limiting her influence in ways that could not be softened by private reassurance alone. What ultimately tipped the balance was not argument, but convergence. Anne's insistence on structure, William's focus on future risk, and Charles's recognition of institutional responsibility aligned in a way that left little room for alternative paths. The decision was not framed as a rebuke. It was framed as a reset. Authority would be clarified. Advisory channels tightened. Ceremonial oversight returned firmly to established offices. These were not symbolic gestures. They were structural corrections designed to prevent recurrence. Yet even as consensus formed, the emotional undercurrent remained. This reckoning was not a victory for anyone involved. It carried a quiet grief, a recognition that trust, once strained, requires time to rebuild. Staff sensed it too. The atmosphere shifted from tension to somber resolve. People spoke less, but with greater precision. The monarchy had entered a phase where every action would be measured, not for impact alone, but for alignment. In private moments following the final discussions, Charles was reported to have sat alone longer than usual, reading through briefing papers he already knew by heart. This was not indecision, it was acceptance. Leadership often requires acknowledging that good intentions do not immunize against consequences. For Charles, this realization cut deeply, but it also clarified his role. The crown does not belong to personal relationships, it belongs to continuity. By the time the reckoning concluded, the path forward was set. The palace would confirm damage, not to sensationalize the issue, but to close it. Boundaries would be redrawn with care, but without ambiguity. Camilla's position would be recalibrated, not erased, yet unmistakably constrained. The institution would move forward more quietly, more cautiously, and acutely aware of its own vulnerability. This internal reckoning did not restore what had been disrupted overnight, but it did something equally important. It reminded everyone involved that the monarchy's strength lies not in the absence of error, but in its capacity to confront error before it reshapes the institution itself. And as winter pressed in around the palace walls, that lesson settled heavily, shaping every decision that followed. Why the palace spoke. For generations, silence has been one of the monarchy's most reliable instruments. It absorbs shock, starves speculation, and allows controversies to exhaust themselves without official acknowledgement. But silence only works when authority remains intact. In this case, authority had been questioned, not publicly but perceptibly, and that made silence no longer protective. It made it dangerous. By the time the palace chose to speak, the decision had already been weighed against every possible alternative, and each alternative carried greater risk. The palace did not speak because of public outrage. In fact, public reaction at that stage remained muted, confused, rather than inflamed. What forced the issue was the realization that ambiguity was traveling faster than truth. Staff uncertainty, diplomatic inquiries, and fractured media interpretation were no longer isolated symptoms. Together, they signaled erosion. The monarchy understood that if it did not define the narrative, others would, and those narratives would not be shaped by restraint or institutional loyalty. Timing was everything. The confirmation was released in the early hours of the morning, not by accident but by design. That window communicates urgency without panic, seriousness without spectacle. It is the hour reserved for moments when the institution needs to speak before momentum builds beyond its control. By choosing that moment, the palace framed the issue as one of governance rather than gossip, reinforcing that the matter at hand concerned structure rather than personality. The language of the confirmation reflected that strategy. It avoided emotional cues entirely. There was no defense, no apology, no justification. Instead, it acknowledged disruption, referenced internal review, and emphasized corrective measures. This was deliberate. The palace was not attempting to win sympathy. It was trying to reassert order. By focusing on process rather than individuals, it denied space for personalization while still admitting that something had gone wrong. Internally, the decision to speak was driven by a sobering assessment of what silence would signal. Silence would suggest tolerance. It would imply that procedural boundaries were flexible, subject to interpretation rather than rule. For an institution whose legitimacy rests on consistency, that implication was unacceptable. The monarchy could not afford to appear indecisive at a moment when it was already navigating health sensitivities, generational transition, and global scrutiny. William's influence on this decision was unmistakable. He understood the mechanics of modern perception better than any previous generation of royals. In his view, silence in the digital age does not neutralize narratives. It amplifies them. Gaps are filled by speculation, and speculation hardens quickly into assumed truth. By speaking, the palace disrupted that process. It replaced conjecture with confirmation, however limited, and in doing so, regained a measure of control. Princess Anne supported the move for different reasons. For her, speaking was about restoring discipline. The confirmation served as a line drawn, a signal to staff and advisors that boundaries still mattered and that deviations would be addressed openly if necessary. It was less about optics and more about internal morale. People needed to know that the system still functioned, that uncertainty would not be allowed to linger indefinitely. For Charles, the decision carried personal weight. Authorizing the confirmation meant accepting public acknowledgement of disruption during his reign. No monarch welcomes such moments. Yet he also understood that leadership sometimes requires visible correction. The crown's authority is not diminished by admitting error. It is reduced by refusing to correct it. By allowing the confirmation to proceed, Charles chose institutional integrity over personal discomfort. The palace also considered the international dimension. Diplomatic partners had already begun seeking clarity through informal channels. A public confirmation, however limited, provided that clarity without inviting further interrogation. It allowed foreign offices to align their understanding with official reality rather than rumor. In that sense, speaking was as much about external stability as internal repair. Ultimately, the palace spoke because silence had ceased to serve its purpose. What had once been a shield had become a liability. By confirming the damage, the monarchy closed a chapter before others could rewrite it. It acknowledged disruption, not to dramatize it, but to contain it. This choice did not resolve every consequence. It did not erase the misstep or its effects, but it did something essential. It reasserted that the monarchy remains capable of self-correction. In an era where institutions are often accused of denial and deflection, that capacity matters more than ever. And as the winter continued, the confirmation stood as a reminder that authority, once challenged, must be reclaimed deliberately or risk being lost entirely. After the damage acknowledged does not vanish. It settles. It reshapes behavior, recalibrates relationships, and leaves behind a residue of caution that lingers long after headlines fade. Inside Buckingham Palace, the days following the confirmation unfolded with an unusual stillness. Not the stillness of denial, but the stillness that follows a necessary correction. Conversations were quieter, decisions were slower. Every instruction carried an added layer of verification, as if the institution itself had learned once again how fragile certainty can be. Camilla's position did not disappear, but it changed in ways that were immediately perceptible to those inside the system. Advisory pathways narrowed. Ceremonial involvement became more clearly defined. Where influence once flowed informally, it was now contained within written boundaries. This was not presented as punishment, and it was not experienced as exile. It was something more unsettling, a reminder that proximity to power does not guarantee freedom from restraint, and that authority within the monarchy is always conditional. For staff, the recalibration brought a mixture of relief and unease. Relief because clarity had returned. Unease because clarity arrived through correction rather than continuity. Many had sensed the drift but lacked the position to name it. Now that it had been called, however indirectly, they moved forward with renewed discipline, keenly aware that ambiguity would no longer be tolerated. In institutions like this, memory is long, and lessons are rarely forgotten. Charles carried the aftermath quietly. Those closest to him noted a deepened reserve, a heaviness that went beyond the usual weight of the crown. The decision to authorize acknowledgement had restored order, but it had also drawn a boundary through his personal life that could not be undone. Leadership once again demanded sacrifice not measured by ceremony, but by silence. For Charles, the cost was not public criticism, but private reckoning. William emerged from the episode more firmly positioned as a guardian of structure, not through assertion, but through steadiness. His approach had been validated, not triumphantly but practically. The future king had demonstrated that restraint could coexist with decisiveness, and that protecting the institution sometimes means acting before fractures become faults. This did not make him colder, it made him clearer. Princess Anne returned to her routines without comment, yet her influence was unmistakable. The recalibration reflected principles she had defended for decades: structure over sentiment, process over personality. Her role in the reckoning was not celebrated publicly, but it was understood internally. In moments like this, authority does not announce itself. It is recognized in outcomes. Beyond the palace, the confirmation began to recede from public attention, replaced by new stories and familiar distractions, but its impact remained. The monarchy had signaled that it could still correct itself, that it recognized when influence tipped toward overreach, and that it would act before erosion became legacy. That message mattered more than any single detail of the controversy itself. What remains after the damage is not scandal, but awareness. Awareness that stability is maintained, not assumed. Awareness that institutions endure not by denying missteps, but by confronting them with restraint and resolve. And awareness that even within the world's most enduring monarchy, balance must be constantly defended. Winter moved on, as it always does. The palace resumed its rhythms, quieter but more deliberate. The damage had been acknowledged, the boundaries restored, and the lesson absorbed. Whether that lesson endures will be revealed not in statements, but in the choices that follow, long after the morning when the palace chose to speak. As this chapter settles into history, one truth remains clear. Power reveals itself most starkly in moments of restraint, not display. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on how institutions, families, and even our own lives handle moments of correction. Share your perspective respectfully. Subscribe for continued analysis and join us as we follow what unfolds next.